Welcome back to the stash. Since the creation of Spider-Man, there have been an insane amount of foes our webhead has faced. With nearly 4,000 comic books under his belt, there's always been one villain who, no matter what, always comes back. And that's none other than the death-defying Green Goblin. Now, Green Goblin has been in Spider-Man comics since the very start almost. He made his debut in the Amazing Spider-Man issue 14 way back in 1964, created by the late great Stan Lee and Steve Ditko. Like a lot of things at that time for Marvel, they were still trying to figure out what works. Before the classic Goblin glider, he used a rather unusual method of transportation, using a rocket broomstick, and even made the Enforcers his goons to help get revenge on Spider-Man. They agree, of course, mostly because Spider-Man did beat the Enforcers in the Amazing Spider-Man issue 10. What's even more weirder than his broomstick is his plan to defeat our webhead. They basically trick Spider-Man to star in a fake movie where they go off script and follow with a series of attacks. However, the outcome obviously was not in their favor. Also, the story had a Hulk cameo as they went into the cave he was hiding in. The initial reaction from the fans to his introduction was very mixed, with a few on edge about this new green and purple foe, with some going as far as saying that Lee and Ditko didn't write a strong enough story to show why he's the most sinister villain our hero has ever faced. However, it wasn't all doom and gloom for the Marvel bullpen, as there were a few positive letters with some praising how his identity wasn't yet revealed. There's always something so wholesome about these old letters. I mean, who would have thought that the Vulture would have been the Green Goblin? Well, except for this fan, of course. Hiding the secret identity was rare at the time, and was a great move by Lee and Ditko, but more on that later. As I read through the letters, I did notice one that stood out, and this one was by Bill Dubay, which reads, "Dear Stan and Steve, with the 14th issue of Spider-Man, you really topped yourselves. Never before in a comic history has there been a supervillain as realistic, weird, different, and as great as the Green Goblin. The name fits the character to a T. Steve Ditko draws him as though there were a real goblin to model for him." He then continued to ramble about who he thought the Goblin was. But what stood out to me about this letter was the initial excitement of this new foe, and the fact that little did they know that he was going to have an amazing history with Spider-Man having some of the best battles you will ever read in comic book media. Green Goblin would show up another 4 times before we actually meet Norman Osborn. During those 4 issues, however, Goblin was fighting against the Crime Master for control over the criminal underworld. It seems like Stan and Ditko really took the not sinister enough part to heart. This era of Spidey comics are honestly some of the best stuff you could read, and I'd highly encourage anyone who hasn't to go out and buy yourself a collection of the Lee and Ditko era. We're introduced to Harry's father Norman Osborn in the Amazing Spider-Man issue 37. I enjoyed how right off the bat in his first appearance, we're shown out just how evil Norman can be. During the story, Mendel Storm is out of prison and sends a robot to Oscorp to get revenge on Norman for double-crossing him. As Spider-Man fights the robot unaware of Norman's presence in the room, he gets hit on the back of the head, resulting in him falling unconscious as Norman leaves him for dead. I enjoy that Lee and Ditko didn't just right off the bat tell us that he is the Green Goblin, and instead just showed us Norman being Norman and attacking Spider-Man whenever he could. After one filler issue being the Amazing Spider-Man issue 38, which is also known as the last Spidey comic drawn by Steve Ditko. Also, a little off-topic question of the day for you guys. Which character did Steve Ditko come back to draw for the late annuals of Web of Spider-Man? Stay tuned at the end of the video for the answer. The Green Goblin returns in the very next issue, which is known as one of the most iconic Spidey covers in history. It was even recreated in a scene from the 90s cartoon. The Spidey book is revamped with the dazzling arts of Jazzy Johnny Ring-a-Ding Ramita, and he brought a much fitting maturity to the book with his art, especially with how Peter is now no longer in high school. The Amazing Spider-Man issue 39 did something that was rarely ever seen before. The Green Goblin discovers the identity of our hero, Spider-Man. That in itself elevated Goblin's status as the big bad of Spider-Man comics. The hero and villain share a battle outside of Aunt May's house, dealing blows back and forth with Peter's clothes slowly being ripped to reveal his Spider-Man costume. Then, Goblin kidnaps Peter, taking him to his lair, where he reveals that he is Peter's best friend's dad, Norman Osborn. Okay, well, at the time they weren't best friends, but later on. Anyway, this issue cemented itself as one of the greatest Spidey stories to ever be released, and is followed up with an equally amazing conclusion in the very next comic, the Amazing Spider-Man issue 40. In this book, we're shown the dramatic origin of the Green Goblin. We discover that the transformation was mostly accidental. Looking through Mendel Storm's formula notes, he tried to see if any were worth keeping. Doing so ended with a flask exploding in his face, exposing him to the Goblin chemicals. Norman was then stuck in hospital recovering from his injuries, although something changed. Norman was now different, more angry, more powerful. After telling his tale, Goblin set Spider-Man free to make his victory more satisfying. The two titans clash once more. As the fight comes to a finish, Goblin hits his head from an attack from Spider-Man, causing him to lose his memory as well as create a fire which quickly surrounds them. Spider-Man burns the Goblin costume and declares that the Goblin is no longer a threat and that Norman Osborn is a hero. For a short time, that was it for the Green Goblin. Time went on and Spider-Man fought new and old villains, however none could come close to the history of the Green Goblin. Then in the late 60s, a magazine brought to you by Stan the Man Lee and John Ring-a-Ding Romita called The Spectacular Spider-Man featured an incredible story of a somewhat obscure battle of Spider-Man and the Green Goblin. Also, a quick fun fact, this story was later reprinted in the Amazing Spider-Man King Size Annual number 9. And another useless fact, this was the only story in that magazine that actually was inked. All the rest were in this nice black and white sort of noir feel to it, but this one was the only one that was actually in color. During a tape showing of Spider-Man footage being presented to the likes of Peter, Norman, Harry, and JJJ, scenes of Spider-Man finding the Green Goblin started affecting Norman in a strange way, causing him to freak out. After repeated exposure, it resulted in the rebirth of the Mad Green Goblin. I love seeing how the fear of Norman remembering the events of his Goblin days sends Peter into a very edgy state. With beautiful pencils by Romita, it makes for a great read. Norman Osborn sets up a dinner with Harry, MJ, Gwen, and Peter to try and expose his identity in a big fight. Of course, Peter thwarts that plan and the fight is led outside. The Goblin uses his new invention of the psychedelic pumpkin and causes Spidey to hallucinate. However, the willpower of Spider-Man is just too strong and deals out an amazing comeback. The fight concludes with Spider-Man using one of the psychedelic bombs on Norman and in doing so reverting Norman back to his previous state. Now around issue 96 of The Amazing Spider-Man there was a somewhat controversial drug issue, a 3-part story which continued as a subplot afterwards about Harry Osborn's drug addiction. That's why if you collect or just look through the history of Spider-Man comics, you'll notice around issue 96 to 98 I think, it's actually missing an approved comic stamp on the top right corner. Stan Lee didn't care about the stamp, he still released it because he wanted to tell the story and he thought that it would be impactful to the lives of many. During this time, there was also another significant part of the drug stories, and that is the return of the Green Goblin. After the last encounter, Norman returned as a normal businessman. He even offered Peter a job. But the further Harry fell from sanity, so did his father, which resulted in more battles between him and Spider-Man. During the last fight, Spider-Man directs the Goblin to get a perfect view of his son's hospital room. The pure shock of seeing his son so ill snapped Norman back to normal yet again. But we all knew that that wasn't going to last. We are now moving on to the big one, the one that changed comics forever. One of the biggest turning points, not only in Peter's life, but also for the relationship between Spider-Man and Green Goblin. The Amazing Spider-Man issue 121 marks the death of Peter's love, Gwen Stacy. In this story, Green Goblin kidnaps Gwen Stacy, and then leads Spider-Man to the Washington Bridge, which sets up one of the most famous fights in comic book history with Gwen Stacy caught in the middle of it. The battle goes back and forth with tension brewing until Goblin knocks Gwen Stacy off the bridge. Spider-Man shoots a web line and catches her, but in the process, snaps her neck. Gwen is dead, and Goblin has killed the only woman he has ever loved, and for that, he is going to die. We move to the Amazing Spider-Man issue 122. With one of the most iconic Spidey covers ever to grace comic shelves, Goblin escapes. Spider-Man has a new desire for blood. So determined on revenge, he goes through whoever gets in his way, and unfortunately leaves Harry when he's in his most vulnerable state. Spider-Man finds Green Goblin in his warehouse, more deadlier than ever. Tonight, it's my game, and we play by my rules, shouts Spider-Man. He continues to beat the life out of the Green Goblin, with each punch dealing more venom than ever before. He finally snaps to his senses as Norman clings to life. As Spider-Man drops his guard, the Goblin tries one last attempt. His glider shoots towards Peter only for him to dodge the attack, resulting in the glider impaling Norman Osborn. And so Spider-Man gets what he wanted, revenge. However, it still doesn't make the pain of losing Gwen any better. He returns home for a beautiful scene with Mary Jane, concluding one of the most daring and emotional stories ever written. Since that day, it wouldn't be till over 200 issues until we next see Norman Osborn. Over that time we saw Harry become the Green Goblin, which was also some amazing stories. And Spidey fights his way through a plethora of villains as well as finally tie the knot with Mary Jane. It was going well for our hero until the infamous Clone Saga happened. I'm going to skip over a majority of the details as this video would generally be over an hour long, but it ended with, or so it seemed, with Ben Reilly and Peter forming a brotherly bond, and Mary Jane getting ready to deliver her first child with Peter. It was a nice and warming part to read for the short time it lasted, until Norman Osborn came back from the dead. It turned out he orchestrated the entire Clone Saga. As Ben and Peter confront Norman, it ends with the death of Ben. It was also revealed that Norman made Peter think he was a clone to further torment him, but it didn't end there. Norman then, through spiking one of Mary Jane's drinks, caused her to have a stillborn. He's taken almost everything away from Peter, his Gwen, his brother, and now his child. Norman and Peter's history, as I've just discussed, is filled with such rich and deep stories. This video could honestly go on for hours about the many battles of these two incredibly captivating characters, However, I chose to talk about the ones that stick out to me the most. I love the classics, and Norman played a massive part within that time period of those Spidey books. He is Spider-Man's true arch-nemesis, the one who always comes back. Spider-Man and Green Goblin trapped in a never-ending battle. A battle in which we've been following for decades. A battle which is forever cemented in comic book history. But that is it for today. If you have enjoyed, please like, comment, and subscribe if you haven't already, because any support means so much. I do hope that this video was enjoyable. It's a bit different from my usual content. I just sort of want to express my love of Marvel Comics, Spider-Man comics, and more specifically the battle between Spider-Man and Green Goblin, as it's just some of my favorite stories to ever read. I know I've probably missed a lot of details. I know I skipped over the Clone Saga a lot. However, there was just so much to talk about that this video could honestly just go on forever, like I mentioned before. But I still just hope that it was enjoyable for you guys. I am willing to maybe do more of these sort of comic videos because they are enjoyable for me to make. And the answer to the question of the day is that Steve Ditko came back in the late annuals of the Web of Spider-Man books to draw Captain Universe. That's right, in a little subplot of those annuals, there'll be a Captain Universe story, and I was so happy to see that Steve Ditko came back to draw those because it honestly were fantastic stuff to look at. But with that being said, thank you guys for watching, and see you in the next one.